Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. Today's deep dive explores Homelessness Is a Housing Problem by Gregg Colburn and Clayton Aldern.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to dig into this one.
Yeah, it's a huge topic, and as we get started, I want to present you, the listener, with a bit of a paradox. It's something you've probably noticed if you've traveled around the United States recently or, even just watched the news. Think about the cities in this country with the most booming economies.
Right.
The places with the most dynamic industries, the highest wages, the most incredible job growth, and just this immense concentration of wealth. Now hold those cities in your mind and think about the cities with the absolute worst crises of homelessness.
I mean, they're the exact same cities.
They are.
Yeah.
And you really have to pause and think about that for a second. Why is it that the places seemingly swimming in wealth and opportunity, the economic engines of the country, are exactly where you find the highest numbers of people sleeping in tents or cars or on the pavement?
It feels incredibly counterintuitive.
It really does. You would think, logically, that a roaring economy would lift everyone up, or at least provide enough tax revenue and resources to manage poverty. But instead, prosperity seems to be running parallel to extreme destitution.
It is a paradox that deeply frustrates residents, baffles policymakers, and completely dominates local politics in those regions. And the mission of our deep dive today is to fundamentally shift how we understand this dynamic. Normally, when society talks about homelessness, we are laser-focused on the individual. We ask a very specific question, which is, why did this specific person become homeless?
Right. We look at their personal life, their health, their family history, maybe their struggles with addiction or mental illness.
Exactly.
Which makes sense on a human level, doesn't it? When you walk past someone in distress on the street, your brain naturally tries to understand their specific individual story.
It's human nature to do that. But today, we're going to change the unit of analysis entirely. We're going to zoom out. Instead of asking why a specific person lost their housing, we are going to look at the regional housing environment. We are going to ask why some cities experience dramatically higher rates of homelessness than other cities. We are going to look past the visible symptoms on the street and examine the structural system of the metropolitan housing market itself.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to really understand the scale of what we're dealing with, we have to look at the baseline numbers. And the numbers are staggering. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, which we usually just call HUD, conducts these major surveys. They estimated that on a single night in 2019, at least 567,715 people experienced homelessness across the country.
And we should clarify how HUD gets that number because it's important context for you to know.
Okay.
That is what's called the point-in-time count. Usually on a freezing night in late January, thousands of volunteers and social workers literally walk the streets of their cities with clipboards.
Yeah.
They count the people in the emergency shelters, the people in transitional housing, and the people they can physically find sleeping outside, in tents, or under overpasses.
But the authors of our source material, Gregg Colburn and Clayton Aldern, are very quick to point out that this official count is a massive underestimation of the true scale of the problem.
Yeah.
I mean, a clipboard count in the middle of January is going to miss a lot of people.
It completely misses the invisible, unhoused population. The federal definition used for that specific point-in-time count excludes a huge number of precariously housed individuals.
Like who?
Well, it doesn't count the family of 4 who got evicted and is now doubled up, sleeping on the floor of a relative's one-bedroom apartment. It doesn't count the person temporarily living out of a cheap motel room on a highway interchange because they have absolutely nowhere else to go.
So if we want a broader picture, we have to look at other data sources. And the book points us toward the U.S. Department of Education. They use a much more expansive definition of homelessness because they are trying to track vulnerable students and ensure they get resources under the McKinney-Vento Act. And their data is just heartbreaking. They suggest there are 1.35 million homeless students in the public school system alone.
Think about that magnitude. 1.35 million children. That figure doesn't even include their parents or single adults or elderly individuals without children.
It's huge.
When you start combining these broader definitions and look at the issue over a wider span of time, say, looking at a person's entire lifetime rather than just one single night in January, the researchers note that roughly 5% of the U.S. population will experience homelessness at least once.
5%. That's 1 in 20 people. That takes it from being an isolated issue affecting a marginal few to a systemic crisis that touches millions of Americans. It means you almost certainly know someone or will meet someone who has fallen through the cracks at some point.
Absolutely.
But here is where that geographic paradox we mentioned in the introduction really rears its head. Those millions of people are not spread out evenly across the country.
Not at all. The unhoused population is incredibly concentrated.
The text highlights just 6 metropolitan areas: New York, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Seattle, and Boston. If you take those 6 cities, they hold over 29% of the entire unhoused population in the United States, almost a third. But if you look at the general U.S. population, those combined cities only make up about 7% of the country.
That disproportionate concentration is the central mystery that Colburn and Aldern are trying to solve. Why those cities? Because homelessness is so concentrated and so highly visible in the downtown cores of these specific places, it naturally elicits very strong, very emotional responses from the public.
A lot of anger.
A tremendous amount of anger. People are deeply frustrated by the human suffering they see on their way to work. They are frustrated by encampments in public parks, and they want to know why this is happening. More often than not, they want to know who is to blame for allowing it to happen.
Which brings us to the political discourse. And as you can probably guess, the political debate around this is red hot. Our sources highlight a very specific, very public debate that erupted in January 2020, right before the pandemic completely changed the news cycle. It was a perfect snapshot of how we argue about this in America.
It really was.
On one side, you had members of the federal government at the time, including President Donald Trump, who pointed squarely at local Democratic leadership in these coastal cities. He argued that the high rates of homelessness were a direct result of their local policies, their tolerance of encampments, and their mismanagement. He specifically referenced the filth and garbage in places like California, framing it as a complete failure of local governance.
Right, and on the other side of that debate, you had state and local leaders pushing back intensely. The most notable was California's Democratic Governor, Gavin Newsom. His argument was entirely different.
What was his stance?
He stated that a severe lack of federal assistance and a historic withdrawal of federal funding for affordable housing over the decades had starved local communities of the resources they desperately needed. In his view, local cities were being left entirely alone to deal with a national crisis.
Now, I want to be very clear with you here as you listen. We are bringing up this specific exchange not to litigate those political arguments. We are not here to take a side between the former president and the governor.
Absolutely not. The reason the authors and we bring up this debate is to illustrate a fundamental reality of how this topic is digested by society. It is almost always framed through a lens of political ideology, finger-pointing, and blame. It is treated as a political football.
Right. It's always your policies caused this, or no, your lack of funding caused this. For the rest of this deep dive, we are going to completely bypass that political posturing. We're going to look strictly at what the data actually shows.
Because when you bypass the politicians and you go out and ask everyday people, just the average person on the street, to explain homelessness, the conversation almost always shifts away from policy and toward individual vulnerabilities.
If you ask someone why there are tents downtown, you will hear the exact same list of individual causes over and over again. You'll hear that it's mental illness. You'll hear that it's a drug and alcohol addiction crisis. You'll hear that it's a result of deep generational poverty. Or you'll hear that people are just unemployed and refuse to work.
And it is completely understandable why people think that. Those individual vulnerabilities are incredibly visible. When you walk through the downtown core of Los Angeles or Seattle, you see thousands of unsheltered people who are very clearly suffering from severe, untreated mental health crises. You see people openly struggling with substance use disorders. Your eyes take in that immense suffering, and your brain naturally concludes that the illness or the addiction is the reason that person is on the street.
It's a straight line. That person is acting erratically and using drugs, therefore the drugs made them homeless.
But the data completely shatters that assumption, and this is the pivot point of the entire book. When you look at those individual vulnerabilities geographically, the assumptions fall apart. Let's take poverty and unemployment first.
Okay, let's play this out. If deep poverty caused high rates of regional homelessness, then the cities with the highest poverty rates should obviously have the highest homelessness rates.
That would be the logical conclusion, but they don't. High-poverty cities like Detroit and Cleveland actually have incredibly low rates of homelessness.
Wait, really? Detroit?
Yes, Detroit. The contrast is striking when you put the data side by side. Let's compare Seattle, Washington, and Cincinnati, Ohio. Cincinnati has a significantly higher poverty rate than Seattle. Seattle is, by most metrics, a very affluent city with high median incomes. Yet, Seattle has roughly 4 times the per capita homelessness of Cincinnati.
4 times, that's massive.
Yes. If deep poverty were the primary driver of regional homelessness rates, those numbers would be reversed. Cincinnati would have the encampments, and Seattle would not. The exact same dynamic holds true for unemployment. The data consistently shows that homelessness is often lowest in the very regions where unemployment is highest.
That feels so completely backward to everything we are taught about economics. But okay, let me play devil's advocate here. Maybe it's not just general poverty. What about the big ones everyone points to?
Yeah.
What about mental illness and addiction? If I walk down the street in San Francisco, almost everyone I see in a tent appears to be in a severe behavioral health crisis. How can you tell me the data says otherwise when my own eyes are seeing it?
It's a crucial question. The authors anticipated this exact skepticism, so they ran the numbers, they analyzed the rates of serious mental illness, illicit drug use, and severe substance use disorders across different regions of the United States. They took that data and plotted it against the rates of homelessness in those same regions.
And what did the graphs look like?
The trend lines are completely flat. There is absolutely no positive correlation. Cities and states with higher rates of mental illness or drug use do not have higher rates of homelessness. In fact, some areas with incredibly high tragic rates of substance use, like parts of the Rust Belt, West Virginia, or Greater Appalachia, have some of the lowest rates of homelessness in the entire country.
So West Virginia has a devastating opioid crisis, but they don't have a massive homelessness crisis.
Precisely. Vulnerable people, people dealing with severe mental health issues, crippling addictions, and economic crises, live in every single city and county in the United States. They are everywhere. But they aren't geographically concentrated in a way that explains the homelessness data. The behavioral health crisis in America is national, but the homelessness crisis is regional.
That is such a vital distinction. The book also tackles a few other common myths you hear all the time at dinner parties or on social media, like the weather myth.
The weather myth. We have to talk about that one.
You hear this constantly about California or Hawaii or Seattle in the summer. The idea that people just move to where it's warm. The theory is that homeless people from the freezing Midwest are hopping on buses and moving to Los Angeles because the weather is nicer for sleeping outside.
It's a very pervasive narrative, but again, the data doesn't support it. The researchers looked at January average temperatures, the coldest time of the year, and mapped them against overall per capita homelessness rates. They found virtually no relationship.
Right, because if warm weather were the main draw, cities in Florida or Georgia or the sunnier parts of the Deep South would be topping the lists. But they often have much lower rates of homelessness than freezing snowy cities like Boston or New York.
Furthermore, demographic surveys of the unhoused populations in these coastal cities show that the vast majority of people experiencing homelessness in a given area were already living and working in that exact same area before they lost their housing.
So they aren't migrating.
No, the idea of the transient homeless migrant crossing the country for better weather, or even for more generous local welfare benefits, is largely a myth. It takes money, resources, and a support network to relocate across the country. People who are profoundly impoverished generally stay exactly where they are. What's fascinating here is how scholar Brennan O'Flaherty perfectly summarizes this disconnect.
Yeah, I love this framing from the book. Let's share it.
O'Flaherty notes that if you conduct an individual-level study, meaning you gather a group of 50 unhoused people in a room and ask what they all have in common, the study will tell you to work on pathology and poverty. You will find high rates of childhood trauma, you will find addiction, you will find mental illness, you will find joblessness.
Because you're studying the individuals who fell through the cracks.
Exactly. But O'Flaherty says if you conduct a city-level study where you look at a map of the United States and ask why City A has 5 times more homelessness than City B, the study will tell you to reduce rents and increase vacancies.
So O'Flaherty is essentially suggesting that people who lose their housing are effectively the wrong people in the wrong place. Their individual vulnerabilities met a structural environment that was entirely unforgiving.
That is exactly it.
That distinction between the individual level and the city level brings us to a really important nuance in the book. And it's the difference between self-reported survey data and structural reality. Because we don't want to dismiss the lived experiences of people who are suffering. When researchers go out and survey people experiencing homelessness, like a massive survey done in Seattle and King County recently, they actually ask them, what was the primary reason you lost your housing?
And the answers they get are deeply personal and often very painful.
In that Seattle survey, 24% of people said job loss. 16% said alcohol or drug use. 15% said they were evicted. 9% pointed to a divorce or a severe separation. 7% said an argument with family or a friend got them kicked out.
And we have to be very clear, those answers are completely valid. We have to honor the lived experience of those individuals. When a person sits down with a social worker and says, I lost my housing because I went through a terrible, messy divorce and I couldn't afford the rent on my own, that divorce was absolutely the precipitating event that triggered their spell of homelessness.
But, and this is the big but of the whole conversation, a precipitating event is not the same thing as a root cause.
It is not.
Because if divorce were a root cause of homelessness, why doesn't every single person who gets a divorce end up sleeping in their car? Millions of Americans get divorced every year. Millions of people lose their jobs. Millions of people have explosive arguments with their roommates or families, but only a very, very small fraction of them end up unhoused.
This is where we have to separate the trigger from the environment, the precipitating event from the structural reality. Underlying vulnerabilities matter immensely, but they only result in homelessness under very specific structural conditions.
Let's walk through a concrete example of that for the listener.
Okay. Imagine you live in a city where housing is abundant and cheap. Let's say Detroit. You suffer a massive precipitating event, maybe you lose your job, it's a crisis. But because housing is cheap, you have options. You might have to downsize from a 2-bedroom to a studio apartment. You might move into a cheaper neighborhood. You might use your modest savings to float your rent for 3 months while you find a new job. You have a buffer.
The structural environment gives you room to stumble.
Exactly. Now, take that exact same precipitating event, a job loss, and apply it to a person living in San Francisco or Seattle. In an environment where the absolute cheapest apartment is $2,000 a month, and there are virtually 0 vacant units available anyway, that person has no buffer.
Right, there's nowhere to downsize to.
Exactly. They can't downsize because the smaller units are already taken by people who earn more than them. Their savings are depleted in 3 weeks instead of 3 months. That exact same precipitating event drops them straight onto the street.
The event was the same. The vulnerability was the same. The only variable that changed was the housing market.
Right. To really drive this home, Colburn and Aldern use an analogy that I think is going to change the way you think about this entire crisis. It is the core metaphor of their research.
It's the game of musical chairs. Let me walk you through this because it is so incredibly illuminating. Imagine you invite 10 friends over to your house, and you all decide to play a game of musical chairs. But there's a catch. You are the host, and you set up the game. There are 10 people playing, but you only place 9 chairs in the circle.
So structural scarcity is built into the game from the very beginning.
Exactly. Now, one of your friends playing the game, let's call him Mike, has a severely sprained ankle. He's on crutches, he's hobbling around. You hit play on the music, and all 10 friends start walking around the 9 chairs. Suddenly, the music stops. Everyone scrambles in a panic to grab a seat. And because Mike is on crutches, he simply cannot move fast enough. The other 9 healthy friends grab the 9 chairs. Mike is left standing alone. He loses the game.
Now, here's the crucial question for you, the listener, to consider. Did Mike's sprained ankle cause him to lose the game?
It's a trick question, really. Because if you look at it purely from an individual level, like the surveys we just talked about, you would say, absolutely, yes. He was the slowest. He had a clear physical vulnerability that prevented him from competing effectively with the other players. If you were a social worker doing a case study on Mike, you would write down sprained ankle as the reason he is chairless.
But framing it that way completely ignores the structure of the game. Under the specific conditions of a game with 10 people and only 9 chairs, yes, his vulnerability dictated that he would be the specific person to lose. But let's change the structural conditions. Imagine you set up a game with 10 people and you put 10 chairs in the circle.
The music plays, everyone walks around, the music stops.
And what happens to Mike? Even with his sprained ankle, even hobbling on his crutches, Mike eventually makes his way over and finds a seat. He doesn't lose, he is seated safely.
Because there is no artificial scarcity.
Right.
The root cause of Mike's chairlessness in the first scenario wasn't his bad ankle. The root cause was the structural lack of chairs. The person who set up the game designed a system where someone, it mathematically didn't matter who, but someone was guaranteed to lose.
This analogy perfectly synthesizes the relationship between individual vulnerabilities and structural housing markets. In the real world, the The sprained ankles are things like severe mental illness, substance use disorders, physical disabilities, sudden medical debt, systemic racism, or even just a run of incredibly bad luck.
Those are the vulnerabilities.
Right. Those personal vulnerabilities determine who loses their place in the housing market when things get tight. But it is the structural scarcity, the absolute lack of affordable units in a city, that determines that a shortage exists in the first place, ensuring that someone will inevitably fall out of the system.
It's a rigged game.
It is entirely rigged by the math of the market.
And when you view it through the lens of musical chairs, it perfectly explains why we see such disproportionate representation in the unhoused population. If the game of musical chairs only has 8 chairs for 10 people, the people who lose aren't going to be chosen at random by a lottery. The losers will consistently be the people with the sprained ankles, the people who are exhausted from working 3 jobs, the people who maybe don't understand the complex rules of the rental application process, as well as others.
Or people who face active discrimination.
Exactly. In our society, that translates to people with extremely low incomes, people of color who have faced generations of systemic redlining, and people with behavioral health issues. They're pushed out of the game first. But, and this is the vital point, they did not create the shortage of chairs. They are just the ones bearing the brutal consequence of it.
Which leads us directly to the core, undeniable finding of Colburn and Aldern's research. We've established what doesn't cause regional homelessness. If poverty, drug use, mental illness, and weather don't explain why Seattle has a massive crisis and Detroit doesn't, what does?
The answer, according to the mountain of data they compiled, boils down to just 2 intimately linked variables: housing costs, specifically rent, and vacancy rates. These are the only variables that consistently, reliably, and powerfully explain regional variation in homelessness across the United States.
I want to quote the book directly here because the authors phrase it so starkly. They write, "Homelessness is largely about the price of homes. Mississippi and Alabama are cheap places to live."
That is the invisible hand of the market at work in its most brutal form. Where housing is cheap and abundant, homelessness is low. Where housing is incredibly expensive and scarce, homelessness is high.
The researchers map this out across several very compelling charts in the book. If you look at the data, and they reference specific figures like figures 22, 23, and 24, the trend lines are undeniable. They aren't scatter plots like the mental health data. They are sharp, clear lines.
Let's visualize those graphs for you. Imagine a graph where the horizontal axis is the median contract rent in a city, and the vertical axis is the rental vacancy rate. When you plot the major U.S. cities on this graph, you see a perfect inverse relationship. As the median rent goes up, the vacancy rate drops. They move in lockstep.
But the real revelation, the terrifying part of the math, comes when you plot those vacancy rates against the per capita point-in-time counts of homelessness.
What happens?
As the rental vacancy rate in the city drops, the rate of homelessness doesn't just go up on a gentle slope, it skyrockets on a steep curve. When vacancy rates dip below a certain critical threshold, usually around 4 or 5%, the housing market becomes incredibly hostile. Landlords hold all the power, and the number of people pushed onto the streets multiplies rapidly.
This raises an important question, though, because I can hear the counter-argument forming from some of our listeners. People will say, okay, maybe there is a shortage of luxury condos or expensive suburban homes, but does a shortage in the general housing market really affect the people at the very, very bottom of the income ladder? Doesn't building expensive market-rate apartments just help rich people?
This raises an important question regarding how a lack of general housing doesn't just hurt the top, but fails to filter down to low-income households, squeezing them out entirely. It's a very common argument in city council meetings, the idea that new construction doesn't help the poor. But the data from what economists call the first quartile of the housing market proves that it absolutely does affect them.
Explain the first quartile.
The first quartile represents the cheapest 25% of all rental units in a given region. These are the aging apartment complexes, the older duplexes, the basement mother-in-law suites. The researchers isolated the data for just these units, and they found that the vacancy rate specifically for this bottom tier of housing is a massive predictor of homelessness.
Because housing doesn't magically filter down perfectly. This is the domino effect of a housing shortage. When there's a general housing shortage, higher income earners, the engineers, the lawyers, the tech workers, don't just throw up their hands and leave town when they can't find a luxury apartment.
No, they down rent. They rent the mid-tier apartments. Because they have the cash, they easily outcompete the middle-class renters for those units.
Right. And then those middle-income earners, the teachers, the nurses, the restaurant managers, are pushed down the ladder. They are forced to rent the cheaper first quartile apartments. And who loses in that scenario? The people at the lowest end of the income spectrum. They have nowhere left to go. The dominoes fall on them.
The competition for that bottom 25% of housing becomes utterly ferocious in a tight market. You have people with perfect credit scores, pristine background checks, and steady, high-paying incomes competing for the exact same aging, cheap apartments as someone who is trying to rebuild their life after a job loss, or someone surviving on a fixed disability check.
In that scenario, the vulnerable person loses every single time. The landlord will always choose the applicant with the highest income and the best credit.
Always. And we have to talk about what happens to an individual once they are forced out of that hyper-competitive market and onto the street, because it is physically and mentally brutal. There is a psychological and economic concept detailed in the text called negative duration dependence.
That's the academic term. But economists and sociologists also refer to it simply as scarring.
Scarring. The principle is deeply tragic. The longer a person is separated from the housing market, the harder it becomes for them to ever re-enter it. Their chances of getting back inside diminish with every passing week.
Let's slow down and really think about why that is. Think about what actually happens to your mind and your body when you are unhoused. First, you suffer from chronic severe sleep deprivation. You cannot get a full night's REM sleep when you are sleeping on a park bench, constantly terrified of being assaulted, or constantly being woken up and told to move along by law enforcement.
You are also entirely exposed to the elements. Extreme heat, freezing cold, rain. The physical toll on your immune system is immediate. Furthermore, the book notes that people experiencing homelessness face significantly higher rates of physical and sexual abuse than the general housed population. They are incredibly vulnerable targets.
And on top of the physical danger, there is the profound logistical nightmare of living without an address. How do you apply for a job when you can't put an address on a resume? How do you get a callback when your prepaid cell phone runs out of minutes? How do you show up to an interview with clean clothes when you don't have a washing machine or a shower?
You become profoundly lonely and separated from your critical social networks, the very friends, family, or former coworkers who might have been able to help you get a job or a reference. The trauma of living on the street physically and mentally alters a person. Their physical appearance may decline rapidly. A gap in their employment history widens from weeks to months to years.
So when everyday people walk down the street, look at an unhoused individual, and blame their current visible mental health crisis or their erratic substance abuse for their homelessness, they're often getting the causal arrow completely backward.
Exactly backward. Ample medical and sociological evidence suggests that severe substance abuse and rapidly declining mental health are very often a consequence of the trauma of homelessness, not the original cause. It is the body and mind's natural, desperate response to surviving in an unimaginably harsh, terrifying environment. People use substances to stay awake because it's dangerous to sleep, or they use them to numb the physical pain of sleeping on concrete.
It's a vicious, accelerating cycle. The tight housing market pushes a vulnerable person out. The trauma of being unhoused creates deep psychological and physical scars. Those scars make them even more vulnerable and less employable, meaning landlords in that already tight market will be even less likely to rent to them in the future. It's complete system failure. So if we know this, if the data clearly shows that high rents and low vacancies are the engine driving this crisis, the next logical question is, why do some cities build enough housing to keep prices down, while other cities let prices spiral completely out of control?
To understand that, we have to look at urban incentive structures and introduce a critical economic concept: housing supply elasticity.
Elasticity, let's break that down.
Elasticity simply measures how responsive a market is to a change in price. If the price of good goes up, does the market naturally and quickly produce more of that good to capture the profit, thereby increasing supply and eventually stabilizing the price?
Like, if the price of apples suddenly triples tomorrow, farmers are going to see a huge profit opportunity and plant a lot more apple trees. The supply of apples is elastic. It stretches to meet demand.
Precisely. In a highly elastic housing market, If a city experiences a massive economic boom, say a huge corporation opens a headquarters there, the population grows and rents naturally start to rise. Developers see an opportunity for profit, so they pull permits and quickly build thousands of new apartment buildings and single-family homes. The new supply absorbs the new demand, vacancy rates stay healthy, and rent growth slows down.
The system works as intended.
But many of our most economically successful cities, the ones we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, have highly inelastic housing supplies. They cannot or will not stretch to meet demand.
And what makes a city's housing supply inelastic? The book highlights two main barriers. The first is purely physical: topography.
Geography is destiny in some ways.
Think about cities like Seattle, San Francisco, or New York. Seattle is essentially an isthmus, squeezed between Puget Sound and Lake Washington. San Francisco is literally on the tip of a peninsula, surrounded by the ocean and the bay. New York City is mostly built on islands. They physically cannot sprawl outward in all directions. They're geographically constrained by water or mountains.
Because of that constraint, if you want to build more housing in those cities, you have to build up. You have to build high rises and dense infill, which is vastly more expensive, mathematically complex, and time-consuming than just paving a flat field and building a subdivision.
So topography is a real physical factor. But the second, and arguably much more potent and controversial barrier, is the regulatory environment. We're talking about strict zoning laws.
Yes, exclusionary zoning, lengthy environmental review processes that can take years, and incredibly complex building codes. But it's vital to remember that these regulations didn't just appear out of thin air. They weren't handed down on stone tablets. They are put in place, maintained, and fiercely defended by people.
Specifically, they are often maintained by existing homeowners, people who want to protect the financial value of their property and the aesthetic character of their neighborhoods.
This brings up the profound generational and class conflict the authors mentioned, specifically referencing another great book, Generation Priced Out by Randy Shaw. Shaw points out a massive divide between older homeowners, often baby boomers or Gen Xers, and younger generations.
Let's trace how that happened. The older generations bought homes in these coastal cities decades ago, back when prices were reasonable and the cities were less globally desirable. As the tech and finance industries boomed, their home values skyrocketed. A house bought for $150,000 in the 1980s is suddenly worth $1.5 million. This created immense unearned personal wealth, essentially a generational home equity lottery.
And a house is often a person's entire retirement plan. So to protect that wealth and to prevent their quiet single-family neighborhoods from changing, they often vehemently oppose any new construction.
They show up in droves to city council meetings to block new apartment buildings, claiming it will ruin the neighborhood character or block their sunlight or cause too much traffic. This is the classic phenomenon of NIMBYism. Not in my backyard. They will say, I support affordable housing in theory, just not right here on my street.
And the tragic result of that NIMBYism is that younger generations and lower income earners of all ages are completely priced out of the city they grew up in or work in. The housing supply remains artificially choked by local regulation, even as demand from the booming economy soars.
To really synthesize how these forces of demand, meaning population growth and supply elasticity, interact, Colburn and Aldern do something really helpful. They categorize major U.S. cities into 4 distinct typologies. This breakdown is brilliant because it perfectly explains the very different realities you see when you travel across the country.
Let's walk through the 4 typologies in detail. The first category is the Rust Belt. These are cities like Detroit, Michigan, Cleveland, Ohio, Chicago, Illinois, and St. Louis, Missouri. The defining characteristic of these cities right now is low, flat, or even negative population growth.
People are moving away, or at least not moving there in massive numbers.
Right. Because the population isn't growing rapidly, the demand for housing is flat or actively falling. In this specific scenario, housing supply elasticity doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if it's hard to build new housing or if the zoning laws are strict because you don't need new housing.
To give you a sense of scale, the book notes that Detroit has something like 81,000 vacant units just sitting off the market. Because the existing housing supply is more than adequate for the current population size, rents stay relatively low, vacancy rates stay high, and consequently the rate of homelessness is remarkably low.
Even though these Rust Belt cities often struggle with high rates of poverty, unemployment, and addiction, the structural housing game has more than enough chairs for everyone. The musical chairs game is played with 10 people and 15 chairs. No one is forced out purely by lack of space.
Okay, the second category is the Sun Belt. Think of the rapidly growing, sprawling cities in the South and Southwest. Charlotte, North Carolina, Dallas, Texas, or historically Austin, Texas. These cities are booming economically. Charlotte's population grew by a massive 28% between 2007 and 2019.
That is faster percentage growth than tech-heavy Seattle during the same period. So demand is going through the roof. People are flooding in.
But, and this is the key difference that saves them, Sunbelt cities generally have highly elastic housing supplies. They are geographically unconstrained, they have hundreds of miles of flat land to sprawl into, and they typically have a much more deregulated pro-development political environment.
When Charlotte's population boomed, the local government didn't block development. Developers responded by building a massive, staggering amount of new housing. They increased the number of occupied rental units by over 43%. Because they built so much so fast, they managed to keep their vacancy rate hovering around a healthy 7%.
The result: despite explosive population and economic growth, Charlotte maintained a relatively low rate of homelessness. They built enough chairs for all the new players joining the game.
Though it's worth noting a very important caveat from the text. Austin, Texas is starting to act as a warning sign for the Sun Belt. While historically highly elastic, recent data from 2019 and 2020 shows that Austin's housing production is finally beginning to fall behind its relentless, massive population growth. They are hitting limits. Vacancies are starting to fall, rents are spiking, and predictably, homelessness is beginning to rise. It shows that even in the pro-development Sunbelt, if supply fails to keep pace with persistent demand, the math will eventually catch up to you.
The math always wins. Okay, moving on to the third category, the megacities. We're talking about the true titans here, New York City and Los Angeles.
The defining feature of megacities is their absolutely enormous baseline populations. Their percentage growth isn't explosive like Charlotte. It's relatively modest in terms of percentages. But because their baseline is so huge, even a tiny percentage growth means adding hundreds of thousands of new people to the region.
And critically, both New York and Los Angeles have highly inelastic housing supplies. They are geographically constrained, New York by water, LA by the ocean and mountains, and they both have notoriously complex, difficult regulatory environments and fierce neighborhood opposition to new development.
So you have immense, constant demand from millions of people crashing into a brick wall of stagnant, slow-growing supply. Rents remain permanently, painfully elevated, vacancy rates are chronically low, and therefore, rates of homelessness are exceptionally high and deeply entrenched.
Which brings us to the fourth and final typology. The boomtowns, cities like Boston, Seattle, and San Francisco. Here's where it gets really interesting, because these cities represent the absolute perfect storm of vulnerability.
They do. They combine the most dangerous elements of the other categories.
They combine the explosive double-digit population and economic growth of the Sunbelt with the highly inelastic, geographically restricted, and heavily regulated housing environments of the megacities.
It is the absolute worst-case scenario for housing stability. You have massive influxes of high-income tech, medical, and finance workers moving in, driving demand and housing prices through the roof. But because of geography and severe NIMBYism, it is incredibly difficult to build enough new housing to accommodate them. The vacancy rates in these boomtowns plunge below 4%, sometimes below 3%. Competition becomes ruthless.
And this creates that agonizing paradox for local mayors and city councils. The very things that make a city successful, a booming tech sector, an influx of high-income workers, massive economic growth, corporate headquarters, are the exact same forces that unintentionally produce structural scarcity and drive long-time vulnerable residents into homelessness.
If a city's housing market is inelastic, prosperity inherently produces displacement. There's no way around it. A booming economy without a simultaneously booming housing supply is a recipe for a humanitarian crisis.
Which naturally brings us to how society, and specifically the legal system, responds to this crisis. Because when a city fails to provide enough housing, the visible result isn't just a spreadsheet. The visible result is thousands of human beings living in tents, sleeping in cars, and occupying public sidewalks. And historically, the primary response from local governments hasn't been to urgently build more housing.
No, the historical response has been to deploy law enforcement to manage and hide the visible symptoms. Cities pass ordinances making it illegal to sit on a sidewalk, illegal to sleep in a park, or illegal to park an RV overnight.
And that approach led to a monumental legal clash that has reshaped policy in the Western United States. The text highlights a crucial case out of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, often referred to as the Boise case. Martin v. Boise.
It is a landmark decision. In this case, the city of Boise, Idaho, was actively citing and arresting unhoused individuals for camping or sleeping on public property. The unhoused individuals sued, and the court handed down a profound ruling.
The Ninth Circuit stated that criminalizing sleeping on the street, when the city's shelter system is already at full capacity and has no available beds, constitutes cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution.
The logic of the federal court was crystal clear, and it roots back to basic human biology. Sleeping is a biological necessity. You cannot simply decide not to sleep. If a person has no home and the government cannot offer them a viable shelter bed, they must, by laws of nature, sleep outside. Punishing them for an unavoidable biological reality is unconstitutional.
The executive director of the National Homelessness Law Center at the time, Ria Foscarinas, summed up the impact of this ruling perfectly. She said that communities must finally find the political will to put housing in place, because housing, not handcuffs, is what ends homelessness.
It forces cities to face the math. You cannot arrest your way out of a structural math problem. If there are 9 chairs for 10 people, putting the 10th person in a jail cell overnight doesn't magically create another chair. It just traumatizes the person, gives them a criminal record, which makes it even harder to rent an apartment, and costs the taxpayer a fortune.
It's such a powerful, logical, legal framing. But it leads to a very frustrating question. A question I think everyone listening is probably pondering right now. If the data from these researchers is so incredibly clear that this is a housing market issue, an issue of elasticity, restrictive zoning, rents, and vacancies, and if even the federal courts are explicitly recognizing that you can't punish people for a lack of shelter space, why is the public discourse still so stubbornly focused on individual behavioral issues?
Why do we keep talking about drugs and laziness when the math clearly points to rent?
Exactly. Why hasn't the narrative shifted?
This is what Colburn and Aldern identify as the ultimate crisis in perception. And it has to do with how human beings process complex information. Humans are evolutionarily wired to look for simple, immediate, and visible causes for the things we see.
We want a direct line of sight.
Right. When you see someone in severe distress on the street, the mental illness, the trauma, or the addiction is right in front of your eyes. It is visceral. The intricacies of single-family zoning laws, historical redlining, and median contract rents over a 10-year period are completely invisible. You can't see a vacancy rate.
But this crisis in perception isn't just an academic misunderstanding. It has devastating real-world consequences for policy and funding. Because when societies collectively frame homelessness as an individual moral failure or purely as a medical and behavioral issue, they direct their taxpayer funding accordingly.
They fund what they think is broken. The text points out that federal dollars meant to address homelessness often flow down to local governments. But those local city and county governments, influenced by this public perception, take that money and hand it over to behavioral health agencies, addiction treatment centers, and emergency overnight shelter providers.
They fund human services. They treat it as a human behavioral problem. They build a massive bureaucracy designed to fix broken people, rather than building a system designed to fix a broken housing market. It is a fundamental mismatch between the proposed solution and the actual root cause of the crisis.
And we have to confront the deep psychological barrier that maintains this mismatch. It goes deeper than just misunderstanding beta. The authors reference concepts from social neuroscience, which documents how society systematically dehumanizes and others people experiencing extreme poverty and homelessness.
What does that mean in practice?
It means that when we view someone on the street as fundamentally different from us, when we label them as deviant, or decide that they are entirely, solely responsible for their own suffering, we build a psychological wall between us and them. It protects us from feeling vulnerable. If they are homeless because they are flawed, then I am safe because I am not flawed.
It's the ancient, deeply ingrained American concept of the deserving versus the undeserving poor. It's a bright line that has been drawn through American social policy for centuries. The logic goes, if you lost your job because the local factory closed, maybe you are a deserving victim of circumstance and we will help you. But if you lost your housing because you are struggling with an addiction, you are deemed undeserving.
And because of that distinction, the general public becomes deeply politically suspicious of using taxpayer money to help people they believe brought the condition upon themselves. They worry that providing free or subsidized housing will just incentivize bad behavior or attract more homeless people to their city.
And we've seen how that plays out.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that psychological wall, that moral judgment, is the single greatest obstacle to ending the crisis. Overcoming this crisis in perception is the only way to generate the massive political will required to fix the structural design of our housing markets.
As long as voters believe homelessness is just a tragic collection of individual bad choices, they will never pressure their city councils to reform restrictive zoning laws. They will never stand up to wealthy NMBO homeowners to demand dense housing. And they will never support investing the billions of dollars required for affordable housing development. They will continue to treat the symptom while completely ignoring the disease.
We have to stop blaming the players for a game that was rigged before the music even started.
To summarize the core message of everything we've unpacked in this deep dive today, personal vulnerabilities absolutely exist. Mental illness, severe addiction, childhood trauma, sudden medical debt, job loss, these are real agonizing factors that affect real people every single day.
But those factors are merely determining who gets left standing in a rigged game of musical chairs. They do not dictate how many chairs are in the room.
And the most important, and perhaps the most hopeful, takeaway from Colburn and Aldern's research is that prosperity does not have to equal scarcity. A booming, wealthy city does not naturally, inevitably have to produce a homelessness crisis. Provided that cities focus intensely on housing supply elasticity, strip away exclusionary zoning, and intentionally design systemic abundance rather than fiercely protecting localized wealth, we can ensure there is a chair for everyone.
It requires a paradigm shift. It requires us to look past our own biases, look past the visible symptoms, and really look at the mathematical realities of our communities.
So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. If the structure of our housing markets dictates that someone must lose, what does it say about our society that we then blame the loser for not having a chair? Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer link in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, when you encounter a complex problem, always look past the symptoms to see the system. Until next time.